He is the recipient of a George Polk Award and Livingston Award for Young Journalists. He is a second-generation Chinese American and lives in New York City. Michael's new book, Strangers in the Land, is an epic story of exclusion, belonging, and the complications of America's multiracial democracy. It's a cinematic, character-driven, deeply researched story of race in America that places Chinese American history alongside other events that took place during a crucial period of formation for the country after the Civil War, when visions of liberty and equality founded. This is not just a story of the Chinese in America, it is a story of any number of immigrant groups who have been treated as strangers. And if you have not yet read the book, you can purchase it in the back of the room or check it out at your Chicago Public Library. Michael is joined tonight by moderator Geraldo Cadava. Geraldo is a professor of history at the Northwestern University and a historian of the United States, focusing on Latinos in the United States, the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, and Latin American immigration. He's the author of two books, The Hispanic Republican, The Shaping of an American Political Identity from Nixon to Trump, and Standing on Common Ground, The Making of a Sunbelt Borderland. And he's currently working on a third book, an overview of Latino history since the Spanish Conquest called A Thousand Bridges. Please join me in welcoming Michael Luo to the CPL stage.
Hey, everybody.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. See if this is on. Okay, yeah, that works. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for coming out. And Mike, thank you for writing this book that has given us the occasion to talk to one another. It's great.
Thanks for doing this, Jerry.
Of course, yeah. So, the first thing I wanted to ask you about in the book, and I've heard you talk about this before too, you have a really interesting story about how this book came about, what the kind of genesis of the book is, and I'm wondering if you could share that with us.
Yeah. The most immediate impetus for the book was I wrote a piece for the New Yorker in the spring of 2021 about this history, particularly about this period known as the driving out, when dozens of communities in the American West physically expelled the Chinese from their communities, and this was the pandemic. It was after the Atlanta spa attacks, and there's kind of surge in violence against Asian Americans, and that essay became kind of this book proposal, and it became this. And it kind of was the intellectual, that set me on this intellectual journey. But there is a personal backstory that really, I think, started all of this. And that was the fall of 2016, October 2016. This was a couple of weeks before Trump was elected. I wasn't expecting it. The country wasn't expecting it. But you could kind of feel this kind of curtain of nativism kind of descending on America. And there was a particular incident that happened to me and my family. It was actually for any Asian American in the audience. I'm sure that it resonates, and it could have just been any other incident, except I happened to be a reporter at the New York Times at that point with a particular platform and audience. It was a Sunday after church. My family and a couple of other Asian American families were kind of blocking the sidewalk on the Upper East Side. We were trying to figure out where we were going to go to lunch, and a woman was really aggravated. A white woman. I describe her in the piece I wrote about as kind of like this well-dressed, typical Upper East Side woman. I went back and read this letter recently, this piece I wrote, and she had an iPhone 6 Plus. Back then, it was a big deal. Meaning she kind of just could have been a neighbor, a parent in my kid's school, and she was annoyed. So she muttered under her breath as she went past us, "Go back to China," even though it was Sunday after church, I didn't turn the other cheek. I basically abandoned my younger daughter in her stroller and ran after this woman and kind of confronted her. And it was essentially like, are you serious? Like, is that what you just said? And we kind of jawed back and forth. We were yelling, and broad daylight, Upper East Side, she screamed, "Go back to your effing country." And the adrenaline is pumping, and I'm trying to come up with a smart retort. And the best I could come up with was, I was born in this country. And it just felt really pathetic. And so what happened is I was kind of live tweeting what happened, and I used this hashtag, #ThisIs2016, as kind of like an observation of like, this is the year 2016, and this kind of thing is still happening. And I wrote an open letter to this woman that we published, the New York Times published, and it became this kind of viral thing. On Twitter, I just remember there was this outpouring from other Asian Americans who had experienced this kind of thing before, people trying to express sympathy. Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York, tweeted at me something along the lines of like, "Mike, you're welcome here anytime," or something
That's nice.
Showing off his bona fides. And what I wrote in this piece was about this kind of sense of otherness that's kind of part of the Asian American experience, and just kind of thinking about this kind of feeling of sadness that I had after I was walking home that day with pushing my daughter, my younger daughter, and my older daughter next to me, just thinking about they're 2 generations removed from my parents' immigrant experience, and just wondering if they would ever feel like they truly belonged in this country. That's kind of what set me on this kind of personal journey in thinking about these questions. Obviously, I had a busy day job. I went to the New Yorker, took a while, and the pandemic and that kind of moment that was such a searing moment for a lot of Asian Americans during the pandemic was what finally led me to say I couldn't really turn away from this moment. I had to write this book.
Totally. I'm a historian, so I love that your answer was history, but it is still, as possible long-term responses to that moment, how did it become, I know what the answer is, I have to write a history book that goes back to the beginning. So what were the steps between that encounter and then thinking that you had to go back to the past to figure out what it was all about?
Yeah. The thing about it is, like, so this, the heart of this book, it starts in the gold rush and goes up to the 1960s when my parents came to this country. My parents came post-1965, the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 that got rid of this quota system that dictated immigration in this country. It's the law that has kind of set in motion this kind of transformation that's demographic transformation that's happening in our country right now. The heart of this book is this violence and turbulence that happened in the 19th century. And to be honest, like before I had set out on this book, it felt kind of distant and kind of foreign. But when I started, when I did that piece for the New Yorker about this history, and I started to immerse myself in the archives, I was just blown away of how relevant it felt to the current moment. And there are all kinds of cliches about history, and the past is never the past. It's not even the past. The past is never dead. Or Mark Twain was history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And I just think that in order to understand the current moment, we do have to look back.
For sure, and I want to talk about some of the ways in which it rhymes in just a minute. First, I also want to dig into the meat of the book, but first I'm wondering if you can kind of quench some of our thirst as Chicagoans who have a lot of pride in our city about the Chicago aspects of this story, because Chicago comes in and out at some key moments, and the time in your book that it first dawned on me that this is also about Chicago is when you mention an address, 323 Clark Street,
Right.
that was the address of a business. And
Yeah.
I looked it up on Google Maps. It's literally right around the corner from here. And
Yeah.
I always love those moments where, you're forced to see this world you live in now, but imagine it 150 years ago being a very different place.
Yeah.
And you describe it as the heart of Chicago's Chinese community.
Yeah.
So what was Chicago's Chinese community in
Yeah.
the late 19th century?
Yeah, so it's I don't want to overstate it for sorry to Chicago. It's not like the heart of the book is in the West Coast and the Chinese immigration was largely concentrated on the West Coast, and the second largest community that really kind of started to take off in the 1870s, 1880s was in New York. But Chicago makes an appearance in the book for two reasons. One of the characters in my book is a guy named Wang Qin-fu, who is like this extraordinary, interesting figure. Kind of, he at one point early on after he came to America, he was kind of this peripatetic lecturer, and he called himself the first missionary from China to America, he went on to become something of a civil rights figure, activist. He formed something called the Chinese Civil Rights League, or Chinese Equal Rights League. And he shows up in the book in Chicago debating another. There was a debate over the Chinese question that was set up by the Chicago Tribune. Actually, they organized this debate, and he's debating what it seems to me is just a random white guy. He was like a city resident who had been a sailor and had been to Shanghai, and so that guy took the anti-Chinese stance, and Wang Qin-fu takes the stance of defending the Chinese, and then he eventually. He's kind of back and forth between Chicago and New York, and he comes back to Chicago in the 1890s, and he restarts a newspaper called the Chinese American, and the Chinese American started first in New York, and it's believed to be the first use of the term Chinese American. But there's a little scene that basically what you're trying to do as an author, it's important that you have protagonists, characters that you can kind of root for and kind of follow over the course of the book. In an ideal world, you'd have like a group of central characters that are kind of, that the book is built around. And I originally had this aspiration that I would build the book around 2 or 3 multi-generational families. The book that I compared this to when I pitched the book was Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, where she built it around a few families. But Isabel Wilkerson interviewed 900 people who remembered the Great Migration. I did not have that benefit, and I quickly found that the archives were such that it'd be really hard to find a central family or families. And so what I have, though, is each chapter has protagonists and characters that are built around. And then one of the cool things is there are these characters that kind of show up across several chapters and kind of help knit it together, and Wang Qin-fu is one of them. Chicago shows up it's almost like a little bit of just a little scene of where Wang Qin-fu shows up at a courthouse with a group of men who want to be naturalized, Chinese men who want to be naturalized, and they were from the Moy clan. This clan of Moys were the ones who were kind of started the Chinese Quarter in Chicago. And there was a few of these mois that Wang Qinfu took to the courthouse and made the petition. He was kind of acting as their translator, saying that they want to be naturalized. And a judge was kind of perplexed by this question, because the law that governed naturalization in the United States went back to 1790, and it reserves it to free white persons of good moral character. And so that's confusing, because where do Chinese fit in that? And interestingly, because it was up to particular judges, some Chinese had actually managed to become naturalized. And so this judge was trying to figure out what to do. And in the end, he rejected their application and ruled that, no, they're not white, and so therefore not able to be naturalized. But the other important thing about Chicago at that point was the Chicago Chinese Quarter really started to take root in the 1870s, early 1880s. And this was when Chinese were starting to migrate out of California, because the anti-Chinese movement was growing in intensity in California, and they started to come east, looking for a place that they would feel safer. And there's a character, one of the mois, who shows up in the book, who started to get worried because there was actually now, a visible Chinese population in Chicago, and he was worried that they would get targeted. And so, anyways, it's just one little historical blip, but it kind of shows the progression of Chinese migration across the United States.
I'm so glad you started to talk about some of the characters and the research behind the book, because, I mean, one of the beautiful things about the book is how many, you have big points. You have a lot of important things to say about politics, the law, about nativism, but it is all being driven through particular characters. I have a feeling that your background as an investigative journalist and the work you do at The New Yorker is a big part of how you thought about writing the book. I remember I've sat in your office where you've told me about like storifying things, and how are you going to storify this? Because you have an idea, but how are you going to tell a story with it? So that's an amazing part of your book. Can you tell us, you can just pick a couple of the characters that most captivated you and that you found particularly compelling, and why don't you introduce us to them a little bit? There's so many. I know.
No, I'll talk about one because I just think it helps understand the challenges and also my process. And so the fifth chapter, I think it's the fifth chapter, is called Rope, More Rope. And it's about the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, which took place in 1871. I don't know if you know it, if you're familiar with it, the worst mass lynching in American history actually involved Chinese, not black Americans. There was this, in 1871, there was this kind of horrific episode of mob violence in Los Angeles, which was basically this kind of dusty frontier town, and 17 Chinese were lynched, and an 18th person was killed. It's so important. It was so important to me in this book to say their names, to humanize them, to make sure that they're not faceless, nameless victims. But you're limited by the archives. It's the powerful that write history, and the powerless are often left out, but not completely. And this is kind of one of the things I'm most proud of in the book in general, and proud of in this chapter about the Chinese massacre in Los Angeles, is the most well-known victim of the massacre was a herbal medicine doctor who was in his 20s or 30s, who was known as Jean Tong. And you knew from, so I had a file folder, a digital file folder that had 300 documents about newspaper articles, manuscripts, about the Chinese massacre. And you're just, my process is I'm basically cutting up all these documents, putting them into a chronology, and kind of telling that story. And with Gene Tong, there were classified ads that told us that he had this store that he rented from a white furniture dealer, and that catered to not just Chinese customers but white customers. Shows enterprise. I knew that he had a wife. I knew he had a roommate. I knew that his the store that he had the signboard outside. I also knew that he had a poodle, a pet poodle, which is an incredible detail. And how did I know that he had this pet poodle? So after he was lynched, a reporter for one of the Los Angeles newspapers went through his store in his apartment where he lived, and it's strewn with detritus. His belongings are everywhere. There's blood everywhere. People had slashed open his belongings because they were looking to rob him. And there was this poodle with a broken leg that was whimpering, and so that's how I kind of constructed this figure that kind of is a focus in that chapter, and also the archives just kind of continued because his wife was initially dragged out of the apartment with him, but they kind of let her go. And she shows up in court documents later because she filed a lawsuit that related to the massacre. Didn't go anywhere, but basically you're able to have an arc with Gene Tong, and it just gives you a sense of what the process is like, and how I tried to establish these characters that you could care about.
I'm imagining you, Mike Luo, the investigative journalist, in your office at home or at work, just with scraps of paper all over the place as you try to put this story together. Is that what it looked like?
No, it's like Evernote. There's this kind of this note-taking. Everyone has different techniques, different software that they use. I just used Evernote, and because you can just kind of digitally snip things and attach like a link that will lead you back to the original document. But every chapter had this primary documents-based chronology that I used to before I made these chronologies before I sat down to write those chapters.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to ask you about Evernote later. It sounds incredibly useful. I also want to know, just maybe for my own personal curiosity, although I think others would be interested to hear this too, how did you write this 400-page book at the same time that you were editing The New Yorker?
So the book party. This is the 8th stop in a kind of crazy 9 cities in 9 days tour. So I'm trying to remember what week we are in, but
it's like more than Taylor Swift. I mean,
the book party for this was last Monday. It was at David Remnick's apartment, and this became a little bit of a running joke at the party because I didn't take time off. I don't know if there are any people who run publications in the audience, but it's a little difficult when your writers take book leave, and we love it when New Yorker writers write books. We celebrate books at the New Yorker, but it's a headache for a manager, because you got to find some way to fill that gap. And the reality is, I maybe am too responsible as an employee. What I did was, I guess, two things. One, I benefited from the fact that I started this book during the pandemic, and we were working remotely, and my kids were going to school remotely. And so when I started this project in the summer of 2021, we moved, our family moved to San Francisco and rented an Airbnb for a little over a month. And I would work I took some vacation in the afternoons. Basically, this book draws on probably 36 or more archives across the country, but the heart of it was in the Bay Area, places like Berkeley's Bancroft Library or the Ethnic Studies Library. There are all kinds of historical societies in kind of mine country in Northern California. The Huntington Library in Los Angeles, we came down to LA. And the heart of the research of the book was, I would just go to these archives. I had a rough sense of what I would need, and I'm just photographing boxes of documents and then converting them into PDFs for later. And that kind of fueled, a lot of the foundation of the book. And I also had researchers at Berkeley that I hired from the Berkeley J School that kind of helped me. I could give a master class that people could pay money for on productivity. I worked 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning. I worked weekends. My daughters play basketball, so I would bring one to basketball practice, sit in a coffee shop for 2 hours, bring her back, bring the other one to basketball practice for 2 hours. That's how I wrote the book. One just little tip. Sometimes there's a thing that people, I subscribe to a newsletter by a writer called 1,000 Words a Day. People talk about how if you're writing a book on deadline, try to write 1,000 words a day. I couldn't write 1,000 words a day, but I could write 200. Like 5:30 to 7:30 in the morning, you can write 200 words, that's a paragraph. And then over the course of a week, that's 1,000 words. And then over the course of a month, that's like 5,000 words, and so you can write a book in 4 years, like I did.
Hear that? That's the free tip for the day here. You had mentioned that this book has all sorts of connections to the present, and in talking with me, you've also mentioned that Chinese exclusion, especially when it comes to immigration, was the kind of template for later exclusions. And I was thinking about that. I mean, sure, there were exclusions of Native Americans in earlier decades. Lots of other communities had been racialized and enslaved. But when it comes to immigration and the exclusion of quote-unquote foreigners, I could begin to see how the Chinese really were the template for later exclusions. And so can you say some of the ways in which basically that they were a template for later exclusions?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to know that for the first century of the American Republic, there were no federal laws governing immigration, any restrictions on immigration. There were some state laws that set certain restrictions, but there were no federal laws, and that's because in the early days of the American Republic, they knew that America needed people to come to kind of establish this country, and there's this famous line that Thomas Jefferson talked about how America needed these great importations of foreigners, and so. The Chinese, so Chinese exclusion or Chinese, it was actually, what we know today as the Chinese Exclusion Act is this law that passed in 1882, but it actually was maybe more commonly referred to as Chinese restriction, and it was basically a series of progressively more onerous laws that essentially made it become Chinese exclusion. Like you see a straight line from that to, in the early 1900s, there was a treaty with Japan that restricted Japanese immigration. Then there was a kind of a Asiatic sort of excluded sort of zone that was
barred zone.
Yeah, barred zone that was created in 1917, and then in 1924 is when the quota system that really heavily favored Northern and Western European immigration and targeted, Southern and Southern and Eastern European immigrants. This is kind of part of the eugenics sort of movement that kind of helped fuel this 1924 law. And that law completely closed the door to all Asian immigration. And you see everything that's happening today, including, this establishment of a vast kind of federal bureaucracy to regulate the border, to regulate immigration, to scrutinize undocumented immigrants. Like this all goes back to this Chinese exclusion.
This period, yeah, exactly. I mean, I want to read one quote from chapter 12 that just stopped me in my tracks. It was the kind of thing where I read it, I had to put the book down, I had to go Google the speaker to learn about it. This is from a senator from California named John Franklin Miller from California. Last name Miller, from California. I had to look up, like, is this Stephen Miller talking, or is this a descendant of Stephen Miller? And I sent Mike like a screenshot of John Franklin Miller next to Stephen Miller because I thought they had to be related because
not related as far as we know.
No, they are not related. They are not related, but just the sentiment is so striking. So here's what Senator John Franklin Miller of California said. He was a member of the Republican Party, which had generally favored equal rights, and this is something he said in part of his argument in support of the Chinese Restriction Act. He said, I believe that the national safety demands an intelligent discrimination, and that it is not only just and wise, but human to keep the bad sorts out. The time for a judicious sifting process has come, and I would sift out the Chinese laborers first, not alone because they are laborers, but because they are unfit, always were, always will be unfit for American citizenship. And it just reminded me now, like, just the kind of debate we're having. We're talking about an invasion and how, there are these ideas about how immigration now is a threat, a fundamental threat to our civilization. Yeah. And I feel like the Republican Party is like making all of these civilizational arguments. And in an interesting way, we've thought about the Trump administration in connection with like 1920s and 30s Europe, right? Where he's a fascist, he's an authoritarian like Hitler was, something like that. But actually, it's more like he's an American from the 19th century, And so there are also, I don't know, I mean, that just really struck me, that connection.
The thing that's really interesting when you read that out loud to me is the way he couches this clearly in looking back, racist, discriminatory, ugly policy that's rooted in racism in kind of a larger noble ideal. One of the most interesting things in the book in this period is how the Republican Party, which is the party of Lincoln, which had eradicated slavery and stood for equality, became just as ugly and vitriolic in targeting Chinese as the Democrat Party, which was rooted in the South, was still, this was this period of, throwing off the shackles of Reconstruction, and what happened was it was basically the country was evenly divided politically. It's polarized, like today. They were fighting for advantage. If you think like it's close today, like back then it was like basically politically deadlocked, and they were looking for political advantage anywhere they could find it. And both parties realized that it would come from the West Coast. California, Nevada, Washington, And so they both, because of politics, kind of bent over backwards, tried to one-up each other in their catering toward this kind of ugly anti-Chinese sentiment as trying to win over and win votes on the West Coast, and so that was when I think about what led to Chinese exclusion, was it race, was it economics? Because there was just like now, there was an economic downturn. I think that a lot of what explains what's happening right now relates to this kind of feeling of stuckness. I talk about this sometimes with our writers as we're kind of trying to figure out what's upstream from Trumpism, and I think income inequality, this kind of stagnation that is going on, is related to that. So in the 1870s, there was this depression. They call it the Great Depression. It was before the 1930s depression became known as that. Was it economics? Was it race? Was it politics and political advantage? Was it religion? I think it was all these things. All kind of mixed together in this kind of toxic brew. And it is just really extraordinary, when you look at the contortions that these politicians went through to couch this ugliness in the name of these lofty ideals.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, you had talked about the Republican Party, how we usually think of them during this period, the Party of Lincoln. And I had been wondering about what you make about the politics of this period, and what lessons you can draw from politics in this period about politics in general. Part of why I'm asking you is I feel like most of our conversations have been about politics, mostly contemporary politics. But, I think one of the things the Democratic Party today, or Democrats are learning, is that, I do Latino history and politics, is that the Democratic Party hasn't always been our friends, even though we have long thought they are. And there's like a similar moment here where Republicans and Democrats both come together in the name of Chinese exclusion. Yeah.
I guess one thing I take away from it is, there are real and urgent and practical things that relate to the way immigration affects, our country, like wages, infrastructure. There's a legitimate sort of policy discussion to be had. I remember there was I don't know if anyone saw this. There was a New York Times visual presentation that was based on cell phone data that showed migration around the world, and there were these kind of lines that were and everything is descending on the United States. And it's an extraordinary visualization, because there's no other real data other than this kind of cell phone data that kind of show this in such stark detail. And so there are some people have been talking about how the 1965 Immigration Act actually was not is an important explainer to where we are economically today. And the thing and I'm not an economist, and I'm not able to kind of sift that data and that argument. The thing I want people to remember is to be careful of how easily that those arguments can fall into scapegoating and just treating people as strangers. The book's title is "Strangers in the Land" is taken from a Supreme Court justice's decision in the mid 1880s, late 1880s, upholding one of the Chinese exclusion laws. And this guy, Justice Field, refers to the Chinese in a negative way talking about how it's impossible for them to assimilate with the rest of us as strangers in the land. And I think there's like a human nature quality where it's just hard for us to deal with difference. And you know, like, you know, one of the interesting things is there actually have been some retrospective economic studies, really interesting stuff by modern day economists looking at wages and the kind of livelihoods of white working class, working men, as they were called back then, laborers, after Chinese exclusion. And the studies have shown that actually Chinese exclusion didn't actually materially lift that of the lives of Chinese, of white workers. There's also studies that show that the Chinese and white laborers essentially were in different labor pools. They weren't actually competing for the same jobs, and I just think that it's just really important to keep this history in mind as we're having this kind of policy discussion.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one real crucial role your book plays, is that a lot of the arguments today rely on unawareness of the past, and your book has kind of brought a lot of these things to light. And that what you were just saying about the two different labor markets, that to me sounds like another way in which the past rhymes with the present. You know, we still see that.
Totally.
So get your questions ready. I just want to ask one more thing. You started talking about, you know, this experience with your daughters after church. And so, you know, this kind of family moment was part of the story of how you got to this book. And now that you're done with the book, I want to ask you, you know, what writing the book has taught you about yourself and your family. You know, the experience with your family led you to the book. Now, how does the book shape how you, what you want to know about yourself and your family and your community?
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say about the Asian American experience is that multiple things can be true at once. You know, the 1965 immigration law prioritized people with special skills and family reunification. My parents, my dad came to the United States for graduate school. He studied he got his PhD in engineering at Northwestern. And my mom was an accountant and was getting her master's degree. You know, and I would say that our, you know, American story is one of upward, you know, mobility. Like, you know, I have a good job at the New Yorker. My brother, you know, worked in Silicon Valley, and you know, but I use this term. I have this line where I talk about how the precarity of the Asian American experience has never really gone away, and I think precarity is a good word, because you could be riding high and, you know, not really feeling like, you know, vulnerable or experiencing, you know, obviously I'm not, you know, being, you know, beaten and by a mob, but then, you know, then the pandemic happens, and there's a president who's referring to the China virus. And, you know, one thing that really worries me right now is, you know, during this history in this book, China was very weak. It was a mess. There was civil wars going on. It was not very advanced technologically. Today, China is a juggernaut. It's an economic, military juggernaut, and it's kind of in vogue for both parties to demonize the threat posed by communist China. And, you know, there are laws being passed that kind of, you know, prohibit Chinese nationals from owning land, and you hear this kind of bellicosity from both parties, really, about China. And, you know, my dad and my parents fled mainland China when the communists came and went to Taiwan. And my dad's dad, my grandfather on my father's side, was a general in the Kuomintang, the KMT, and was actually disappeared and presumed killed in one of the final battles between the communists and the nationalists. And when you talk to my parents about communist China, and there's definitely this kind, there's a wariness, obviously, you know, but like every time I hear, you know, somebody, you know, our president say China, or like,
That's a pretty good impersonation, actually.
that, like, I just feel the kind of tinder of racial suspicion just growing, and yeah. So I'm just the thing that I guess the thing that it's been a real kind of joy and blessing that my kids have watched me write this book, and you know, they were at the launch event in New York last week, and now my 11-year-old, though not my 16-year-old, my 11-year-old is reading the book right now, and I was just talking to her on the phone, and I think she's made it to. I think she just finished the rope chapter, on the Chinese massacre, you know, and I think it's a gift that they can, you know, this generation trying to figure out their Asian American identity and what it means to them. I think knowing this history will be really formative.
Yeah. I just want to say it's astonishing that your 11-year-old is reading this book. I had a fight just this morning with my 11-year-old about how he hates chapter books. And this book has like 30 chapters. There's absolutely no way he would make his way through
I have
this.
to quiz her on it later, but I mean, yeah, I've gotten this question a lot, actually, about what to say to kids of the next generation, and actually what I've said is, like, I would love if we could just start with reading. I would love it if they read, because I am worried about their attention spans, you know, the thing that there's a line from Charles Yu, who is a novelist who wrote this book called Interior Chinatown, gorgeous book. That's the epigraph to the book. If you've not read Interior Chinatown, highly recommend it. It's the central character in it is a background actor in a TV show about a black cop and a white cop, and he is generic Asian man, and in the show, and he. His biggest aspiration is to become kung fu guy, and you know, if it's not obvious, it's an indictment of the way race in America is often viewed through this lens of black and white. And there's this imaginary court scene where he's kind of litigating his case, and he says, "Who gets to be an American?" And that's the epigraph to the book, and that's kind of a central question in the book. But he goes on in his little soliloquy, and he says, "We keep falling out of the story, even though we've been here for 200 years. And that's why I wrote the book, because we keep falling out of the story, and writing this book is trying to write us into that story.
Thank you so much, Mike, for writing the book. It's beautiful. I encourage you all to pick it up and read it. It's wonderful. And now we are ready to take some questions.
If you'd like to ask a question, please come up to the microphone so we can all hear. And I'll start with a question from some of our virtual viewers. Was there anything that surprised you that you discovered when you were researching the book?
I guess the thing, maybe this isn't exactly so the thing so I'm a writer, and so whenever you're a writer, Jerry and I talked about this of like how do you storify something? And the thing that's kind of amazing to me is when I looked at this history, I saw a narrative arc that, you know, like in its kind of like most simplified form. A lot of screenwriters kind of have this kind of formula of like you have the central protagonist who confronts a series of complications, then there's kind of this rising tension, and then you reach this kind of climactic sort of moment, and then there's some sort of resolution, and the kind of tension kind of ebbs. And, you know, that kind of climactic sort of moment in this book, in the heart of the book, is this kind of driving out period when the people were trying to expel the Chinese, and they didn't succeed. What you wind up with is a story of resilience and persistence, and that was, I think, you know, one of my pleasant surprises. It's what I think has allowed me to write a book that I think will pull people through it, because there's kind of this narrative arc in the Chinese experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to put this. So a couple of questions, and I don't know if it'll end in a simple question or not, but I'm thinking, well, okay, when I think of China, I always think of like the ultimate longest civilization on this planet. Yeah, that's probably true, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, with all this, you know, transitioning from China, you know, that mainland place in Asia, to the United States, well, why would you want to do that? But also, is there something lost in translation? When I think of the Chinese language, I think of, well, I think of English as always evolving, because you can always change and add words and idioms and everything. But in China, the big change was when the communists took over and they tried to simplify it slightly.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, so the Chinese are thinking in their own language, I would guess, in some sense.
Yeah.
So coming to the United States, wow, I mean, it's hard to translate Chinese sometimes.
Yeah.
Especially, there's no phonetics in it at all, right? Yeah, I don't know if that's a question or I'm trying. It's sort of a neutral question. Like,
Right.
if you're thinking in a different language and you're
Yeah.
dealing with a different world, yeah, is there something lost in translation?
Yeah.
Even for you when you're writing
Yeah,
in
totally.
English
Yeah,
versus
good.
writing in Chinese?
I think I'll take your question in a particular way. So one of the interesting things about the book is, like, there are a lot of Christians in the book, Chinese characters and pastors, and the reason is there are a lot of this relates to the archives, and so there are a lot of churches, denominations that sent people to the West Coast to evangelize the Chinese, and so some of the white characters who populate the book are pastors, missionaries who worked with the Chinese, and you get, you know, them in full humanity of idealism. In some cases, these pastors were incredibly brave in standing up to anti-Chinese sentiment, but they also referred in some cases the Chinese in really ugly ways, and you know, and blamed their character on their heathenism and things like that. There are also a lot of Chinese a disproportionate number of characters in the book who are of the Chinese characters who are Christians, and the reason is the archives, because they became Christians because they took English at these Chinese churches, and they learned English, and in some cases they actually became missionaries themselves. There's a guy named Hui Qin who's got this incredible story, who came as a teenager, worked as a servant boy in San Jose, and then became a Christian, and then he came to New York and started a church and married a white woman, and he left behind a memoir that's pretty incredible. You know, there's another really unusual diary that was left behind by a Chinese man named Ah Quinn, who was kind of known as the kind of Chinese mayor of San Diego, and I think he started keeping this diary to kind of practice his English, and so you get this very rare record of a Chinese experience in America because he was writing in English. There aren't actually, and I know this because it's not because, like, you know, I'm the one who's done the ransacking of the records, but Gordon Chang is this great Asian American studies professor at Stanford who did this big project, transnational project about the railroad, where he enlisted scholars in China and the United States. They looked everywhere for letters in Chinese, archival records in Chinese that kind of captured the railroad experience, and they didn't find any. And it could be because in China, the Cultural Revolution, anything Western was burned and disposed of because that would be dangerous. It could be because in the United States, a lot of Chinatowns were burned down and destroyed, and those records might be gone. My Chinese is mama hoo hoo. It's like, okay. It's, and then my reading of Chinese, I don't read well enough to read a newspaper, but actually, just a bit of trivia is that actually wouldn't be that helpful in this case, because the Chinese that you need to be able to read from this period is classical Chinese. And I had a researcher at Berkeley who was from Shanghai, could read, native Chinese, and she had to call her dad to try to get him to help, like with some of these. There are some Chinese diplomatic documents and other kind of more at the kind of diplomatic level that were left behind. So I eventually got a different researcher at Berkeley who actually studied classical Chinese, and so he could actually translate some of these documents. Also, there were Chinese newspapers, Chinese language newspapers that were published in the U.S. And written in classical Chinese. I don't know if that answers your question directly, but it's just a little glimpse into it.
Yeah. Can I add like 10 seconds? You don't have to respond. Yeah, I have this interest in ancient China, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there was this transition when the communists took over. I understand there was a simplification, right, of the language.
Yeah.
Yeah. So ancient China. Do the Chinese, like in China, do they still value, ancient China? Yeah, I'm just going back to this. It's such on the whole planet Earth, it's such the very first strong civilization that's still a strong civilization.
Yeah. No.
So
I think.
Anyways, there's this interruption between ancient China and then other things, and then all of a sudden the communists simplify something.
No, I
how
think
do you translate anything?
Yeah. No, I think there is tremendous pride in Chinese in the length of Chinese civilization history. I mean, just bringing it back to Wang Qinfu when he would kind of debate, have these debates over the Chinese question. He would boast about Chinese civilization and its duration and all the things that came from Chinese civilization. So I do think that there's tremendous pride in that.
Hi. Congratulations on the book. This is Amy Yee, and we met in New York years ago.
Great to see you.
Huge congratulations. It's such an endeavor. It's like childbirth, but it takes much longer. So thank you for doing this. And I know for me growing up, I had no Asian American history and learned it on my own as an adult. And I think many Asian Americans would probably say similarly. So I hope that changes.
Yeah.
So a simple question I have is someone asked me this when I was giving book talks for my book, and it was so interesting. She asked, what was something that was left out of the book that you couldn't fit in that you wish you could have kept? So that's sort of a layup question for you, and then I'm going to sneak in a second one about. I'm glad you mentioned Gordon Chang, and there are a lot of historians, and we have a historian here who has a PhD, and a lot of historians who have approached Chinese American history. What did you think how did you think you could approach this differently in a way that an academic didn't?
Great question. What did I leave out? So the book is 160,000 words. There's 40,000 words of endnotes. I actually wanted to get it a little bit shorter, actually, and so there was a period when I cut 20,000 words from the manuscript just by squeezing sentences. One just little thing that comes to mind is the story of the Mississippi Chinese, which is in Ryan Coogler's new film Sinners. There's this incredible community of Chinese that made their way to the Mississippi Delta and occupied this really interesting niche in the Jim Crow South, where they were grocers and they served black customers because no one else would. And it's a fascinating community, fascinating that they ended up there. And they didn't end up in the book because it just didn't work in my structure. Like I thought about having a chapter about them, and it just didn't work in what I was mapping out. And so, yeah, that's one thing that comes to mind. The historian question is a great question, because I am indebted to people like Gordon Chang, May Nye, Erica Lee, Beth Lou Williams. In the acknowledgments to my book, I kind of call out on different subjects recommended reading for people who want to go more in depth. And I'll also say that some of their books are written incredibly, are beautiful books. You mentioned Gordon Chang. His book on the railroad, Ghosts of Gold Mountain, is a beautifully written book. Like what I would say though is, I'm a journalist and not a historian, and so I'm a storyteller by training. And another journalist who writes history that is somebody I deeply admire is Rick Atkinson, former Washington Post reporter who now has written a trilogy on World War II, and his second book on the Revolutionary War came out on the same day as my book. And I saw an interview that he did where they asked him about a kind of a knock on him, where that he's less interested in making an argument and more interested in telling a story. And he said, guilty, guilty as charged. I'm interested in telling a story. And I would say the same thing. I might adjust it a little bit because I do think that I make an argument by telling the story. But it's kind of, that old kind of adage of, show, don't tell. Like it's kind of an understated thing. But yeah, like I'm indebted to many historians who have come before me.
As a historian, I was also thinking about what you said about screenwriters, how they have this kind of formula of main protagonist that goes through some stuff.
Yeah.
Hopefully comes out on the other side. I see why that's a compelling story. I don't know that always works for historians. It might not go that way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but that's what I was actually saying. That was such a pleasant surprise. Is I saw in this history, like this kind of narrative arc, and that's just kind of what was there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And just hopefully this might be incorporated into school curricula. So Illinois was the first state in the U.S. to require a unit of Asian American studies in K through 12 curriculum. So
I hope so.
Never thought I would see that. So
Yeah.
And we have time for one more question.
Oh, can I please have an extra 10 seconds? No, first, I know ladies first. It's an extra 10 seconds. Say the last question. I know, just like 10 seconds.
Thanks very much. I wanted to, the things that you said have felt very relatable to me personally as also a child of Chinese immigrants, and I really appreciate what you said about the Mississippi Chinese, because that's my experience. I grew up in a small town in Arkansas. This child, these family groceries, serving those communities. And I feel like that's such a different experience than many other experiences I hear, where maybe my cousins who grew up in the San Francisco area, who going to Chinese school, being around other kids as opposed to being the only one. Yeah. And yet, that is also an experience of being a Chinese American person in America, right? Your experience of maybe knowing some Chinese, my experience of maybe knowing some, feeling that I don't know enough, or I should be this, or I
Yeah.
should be that. Even your own parents' experiences of, I don't know what I'm getting at, but I think I'm thinking
Yeah.
about this internalized discomfort, right, of am I Chinese enough? Am I American enough? And I feel like when we're talking about what it means to be Chinese American, there always seems to be this sense other people are othering us, but we're also othering ourselves. So I thought I'd ask you to expand on that a little bit more, and also, if I can do for a little bit, whether you would revisit that anecdote that you started this off with the Upper East Side lady, whether you would act any differently now, or, because it sounds in some ways almost
Yeah.
like you wrote this book
Yeah.
to her.
I would give her the book and say you can buy it. No, well, I mean, the question that you asked earlier about the kind of I guess it's like kind of an internalization of, it's this kind of one of the things I'm responding to in writing this book is this kind of feeling of invisibility, and yet there's actually some sort of aspects of kind of self perpetuating kind of invisibility that our own community kind of feels reluctant to kind of take up space. The thing that I have found in the course of the week and a half since the book came out is there's so much pent up feeling about this invisibility and this kind of desire to occupy space that, when in the kind of best moments of when I've talked about this book with different communities, I think the New York launch was a standing room only kind of a room full of people, Chinese, Asian American, others who, and you could just feel that that release that comes from talking about this book and having a book like this, and I honestly, like, looking out at the audience, I got kind of emotional because, like, this is everything that I wanted. I imagined that the book could become not just a book, but a cause of sorts, and I hope that people buy the book, give it to their friends, give it to their kids, because it's part of the process of taking up space, so that is the greatest aspiration of this book. So thank you.
And now we've learned it's appropriate for ages 11 and up. So you can do that.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight, but please, one more round of applause for Michael and Geraldo. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. I want to remind you that there are many, many programs happening here as well as throughout our branches for Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So please check out our website for more information on all of that. And books are for sale.